Hello, this lecture is intended for students taking Anatomy and Physiology 2 with Gina Piscatelli at Madison Area Technical College. Please refer to your syllabus for study questions and assigned readings that are associated with this topic. And the topic is blood flow through the heart. From the previous discussion of heart anatomy, you are already familiar with the location of the four heart chambers. In this presentation, we will examine the path that blood takes through these chambers. First, it's important to realize that both the right and left atria fill simultaneously, and they both contract simultaneously. In addition, both ventricles, right and left, will fill and contract at the same time. This cycle of contraction of the heart chambers ensures that blood is sent to the lungs and to body tissues simultaneously. When both atria contract, blood is sent into the respective ventricles. When both ventricles contract, blood is sent from the right ventricle towards the lungs and from the left ventricle towards the systemic body tissues. So the heart functions as a double pump, really. One pump is called the pulmonary circuit. The second pump is called the systemic circuit. Let's examine these diagrams to understand both circuits. The diagram on your left represents the anatomy of the great vessels with much more accuracy. So I'm going to use that one initially. But if you become confused, the diagram on the right is highly schematic, and it might help you picture the overall function better. But to start, using the diagram on the left, note that the right ventricle, shown as blue, pushes blood into the pulmonary trunk and therefore the pulmonary circuit. The blue indicates that the blood is not adequately oxygenated. That is why it's traveling to the lungs. Now look at the left ventricle, shown as red. It pushes blood out the aorta into the systemic circuit. If you trace the pulmonary circuit from the lungs back to the heart, you will see that oxygenated blood, shown as red, returns to the left side of the heart, into the left atrium. Also, tracing the blood from the body tissues back to the heart, you will see that deoxygenated blood returns to the right side of the heart, the right atrium. The blood is returning via the vena cava. This ensures that blood returning from the body, which is oxygen poor, will quickly enter the right ventricle to get pumped into the pulmonary circuit in order to be oxygenated by the lungs. It also ensures that blood returning from the lungs that is highly oxygenated enters the left ventricle quickly so that it can be pumped out the systemic circuit through the aorta. A consequence of blood flowing through the heart and these two circuits is that the chambers on the right side of the heart contain deoxygenated blood, while the chambers on the left side of the heart contain oxygenated blood. This is best seen in the schematic diagram on the right. Let's review the pulmonary circuit for the purpose of accurately naming the vessels. Beginning at the right ventricle, oxygen-poor blood, shown as blue, flows into the pulmonary trunk, which splits into right and left pulmonary arteries. These arteries travel to the lungs, blood is oxygenated, and then pulmonary veins carry oxygen-rich blood back to the left atrium. So when it's called a pulmonary artery, it is carrying blood away from the heart, not necessarily oxygenated blood. The pulmonary veins, of course, are carrying oxygen-rich blood, which is not normal for veins. So the term vein refers to the fact that blood is traveling towards the heart. Now let's review the systemic circuit in more detail as well for the purpose of accurately naming the vessels. Beginning at the left ventricle, oxygen-rich blood, shown as red, is pumped into the aorta. The aorta and its smaller branches carry the blood to capillary beds located in systemic tissues. In the capillary beds, oxygen will diffuse out of the blood and carbon dioxide will diffuse into the blood. The oxygen-poor blood then leaves the systemic capillary beds, traveling in veins that merge into the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, which both return blood to the right atrium. Now let's look at how a volume of blood moves through the heart and both circuits. Although this may seem redundant, I think repetition will help you retain the knowledge, and once you've got it, you'll never forget it. So let's review the flow of blood through the heart by tracing the path of a single red blood cell. You can follow the diagram as I describe how a red blood cell moves within the heart, as well as how it moves through both circuits. First, I'll start with a red blood cell in the superior vena cava. I arbitrarily picked this location, and it's labeled as number 1 on the picture. The cell flows into the right atrium, which is labeled number 2. When both atria contract, this red blood cell moves to the right ventricle, which is labeled number 3. When both ventricles contract, this red blood cell moves into the pulmonary trunk, labeled number 4. This is the beginning of the pulmonary circuit, and the pulmonary trunk splits into the left and right pulmonary arteries. And I arbitrarily again decided that this cell will move in vessels going to the left lung, labeled number 5. Here the cell will pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. The oxygenated cell will then return in pulmonary veins, or a single pulmonary vein labeled number 6, to the left atrium labeled number 7. As both atria contract, this red blood cell will move into the left ventricle labeled number 8. Now when both ventricles contract, the red blood cell we're following will move into the aorta labeled number 9. The cell has oxygenated hemoglobin, so the cell will travel from the aorta to a capillary bed in the body labeled number 10, where it can drop off this oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide. The cell will return to the heart in systemic veins, which lead back to one of the vena cava, and we're right where we started. Please note that the cell goes through the heart 2 times, first on the right side and then on the left. When it leaves the right side of the heart, it enters the pulmonary circuit. When it leaves the left side of the heart, it enters the systemic circuit. Now let's look at some factors which actually make the blood move. Movement of blood is termed blood flow. There are 2 aspects to blood flow. One is force, which we refer to as pressure, and the second is direction. Considering force or pressure first, it is logical that there must be some force existing that pushes on the blood. And in fact, it is contraction of the myocardium that provides a physical force. As a chamber fills, the myocardium stretches and then contracts. Contraction of the myocardium causes pressure to build in the chamber. And pressure is important because blood will always move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Now let's consider the direction that blood flows and how it's regulated. There are really three factors that determine which direction blood will flow. One factor is that blood will move wherever pressure is lowest. The second factor is the sequence in which the chambers fill and contract. We refer to that as the cardiac cycle. And the third fact is that valves prevent blood from flowing into the wrong chamber or going in the wrong direction. They prevent backflow. So valves ensure the direction, and there are 4 valves that play a role. 2 are called atrioventricular valves, or AV valves, and 2 are called semilunar valves. The 2 atrioventricular valves are the tricuspid valve on the right side and the bicuspid valve on the left side. And the 2 semilunar valves are called the pulmonary semilunar valve at the base of the pulmonary trunk and the aortic semilunar valve at the base of the aorta. The 2 atrioventricular valves, of course, are named by the location between the atria and the ventricles. They can open only in one way or one direction, and that is into the ventricles. If blood presses upwards from the ventricle, the AV valves will close. The 2 semilunar valves function similarly. They're named because their shape reflects a half moon, and they're located at the base of the 2 great vessels that carry blood away from the heart. They also open only in one direction, into the vessels when the ventricles contract. To understand their function, imagine that both ventricles are contracting. Pressure builds in the ventricular chambers, pushing on the blood within. The AV valves then will close, but both semilunar valves open. This allows blood to move into the pulmonary artery and the aorta, but prevents blood from regurgitating into the atria. Please note that a valve does not have any contractile properties. It is composed of connective tissue, not muscle tissue. So it can only open or close due to the pressure of blood acting upon it. An example of valve function is depicted in this slide. When the right atrium fills, as shown in the upper left diagram, blood forces the tricuspid valve to open. Blood then flows into the right ventricle. When the ventricle contracts, blood again presses onto the tricuspid valve, but because it doesn't open in that direction, blood will not flow backwards. Chordae tendineae, which keep the valves in place, help prevent a valve from prolapsing. Prolapse is a bulging of a valve into the wrong chamber or location when it closes. If a valve does prolapse, as is shown in the picture of the heart on the left, blood will move in the wrong direction. So long as the integrity of the valve tissue and the chordae tendineae remain intact, the valves will close properly and not bulge into the wrong chamber. That really concludes the information for blood flowing through the heart. I would recommend that you look at these review questions and trace the path of a single red blood cell through the heart, and the answers are provided on the next slide.